The quill hovered above the parchment, its shadow trembling in the candlelight of the estate's grand library. Duke Ashford Thorne's lips curved into a satisfied smile as he prepared to sign the foreclosure deed that would strip the last vestiges of dignity from the Bennet family. Outside, rain lashed against the windows of Ravensmere Manor, as if the heavens themselves wept for the injustice about to be sealed with ink. But before the tip of the quill could touch paper, the heavy oak doors burst open. A young woman stood in the doorway, her simple tavern dress soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her pale face, clutching a weathered leather document case to her chest. Her voice, though breathless, cut through the room with startling clarity. "That deed is a forgery, Your Grace, and I can prove it. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled." Eleanor Bennet had known the weight of expectation since the day she was born into one of Hampshire's most respected gentry families. The youngest of three daughters, she had been raised within the elegant walls of Ravensmere Manor, a sprawling estate that had belonged to the Bennets for 5 generations. The manor's limestone facade gleamed like a jewel in the Hampshire countryside, its formal gardens stretching toward ancient woodlands that had witnessed centuries of family history. Eleanor's childhood had been one of privilege, filled with music lessons, watercolor painting, French tutors, and the gentle pursuits expected of a young lady of quality. Her father, Thomas Bennet, had been a kind but financially imprudent man, investing heavily in ventures that promised much but delivered little. Her mother, Catherine, had died when Eleanor was only 12, leaving behind 3 daughters who would need suitable marriages to secure their futures. Eleanor's 2 older sisters had married well, one to a baronet and another to a prosperous merchant, both leaving Ravensmere to establish their own households. Eleanor, at 19, remained at home, the last unmarried daughter, the one upon whom her father's hopes for financial salvation now rested. For 2 years, her father had negotiated with the Duke of Thornbury, Ashford Thorne, whose vast estates bordered their own lands. The Duke was a man of considerable wealth and influence, recently widowed, and in need of a wife to manage his household and provide him with an heir. He was 42, more than twice Eleanor's age, with steel-grey eyes that never seemed to soften, and a manner that suggested he viewed marriage as a business transaction rather than a romantic union. Eleanor had met him only 3 times, each encounter formal and uncomfortable, his conversation limited to discussions of property boundaries, agricultural yields, and the efficient management of servants. Nevertheless, the betrothal had been arranged. The marriage settlement promised to clear her father's debts and provide Eleanor with a comfortable, if loveless, existence as a duchess. The wedding was set for the first week of June, just 6 weeks away. Eleanor had resigned herself to this fate, understanding that duty to family superseded personal happiness. She spent her days overseeing the household at Ravensmere, reading in the library her mother had loved, and taking long walks through the gardens where she had played as a child. The Duke visited Ravensmere every Sunday afternoon, inspecting his future property with the eye of an acquisitor rather than a guest. He would walk through rooms with her father, discussing which furnishings might be sold to settle remaining debts, which portraits might be moved to Thornbury Hall, and how the estate might be managed after the marriage. Eleanor observed these visits with growing unease, noting how the Duke spoke of her father with barely concealed disdain, how he examined every aspect of Ravensmere as if calculating its worth down to the last candlestick. During one particularly uncomfortable Sunday visit, the Duke had brought his solicitor, a thin, weasel-faced man named Cornelius Hargreaves, who spent 2 hours reviewing the estate's financial documents with Eleanor's father. Eleanor had served tea in the drawing room, her hands steady, despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach as she watched her father's face grow progressively paler. After the solicitor and the Duke had departed, Thomas Bennet had locked himself in his study for the remainder of the evening. Eleanor's only confidant during this period was Mrs. Beatrice Ashworth, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Bennet family since before Eleanor was born. Beatrice, a widow herself, possessed the practical wisdom of someone who had witnessed decades of human folly and triumph. She had watched Eleanor grow from a bright-eyed child into a thoughtful young woman, and she alone seemed to understand the quiet desperation behind Eleanor's composed facade. "You needn't go through with it, Miss Eleanor," Beatrice had said one evening, as they sat together in the manor's still-room, preparing lavender sachets. "There are other ways to survive in this world." But Eleanor knew better. Her father's debts were substantial, and the Duke's offer was the only thing standing between the Bennet family and complete ruin. She had read the settlement documents herself, understanding that if she refused the marriage, foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. Ravensmere would be sold, her father would be left with nothing, and she would become a burden to her married sisters. The golden cage of her privileged upbringing had become a trap, and the Duke held the only key. As May progressed and the wedding date approached, Eleanor found herself dreaming of escape. She imagined running away to London, finding work as a governess or companion, living a modest but independent life. Yet each time these thoughts arose, she remembered her father's exhausted face, the weight of generations of Bennet history within Ravensmere's walls, and the duty that bound her to this predetermined path. The Duke had made it clear that upon their marriage, her father would be permitted to remain at Ravensmere as a tenant. A small mercy that Eleanor understood was designed to ensure her compliance rather than demonstrate compassion. The atmosphere at Ravensmere grew increasingly oppressive as the wedding preparations continued. Seamstresses arrived to fit Eleanor for her wedding dress, a magnificent creation of white silk and French lace that felt more like a shroud than a celebration. Invitations were sent to neighboring families, responses carefully catalogued by the Duke's secretary. Every detail was managed with military precision, leaving Eleanor feeling less like a bride and more like a piece of property being transferred from one owner to another. On the last Sunday of May, just a week before the wedding, the Duke arrived at Ravensmere with unexpected news. He requested a private meeting with Eleanor's father in the library, and though she was not invited, Eleanor lingered in the hallway, her heart pounding with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Through the heavy door, she could hear raised voices, her father's tone desperate, the Duke's cold and implacable. When the door finally opened, Thomas Bennet emerged, looking as if he had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. The Duke swept past Eleanor without a glance, his expression one of grim satisfaction, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and the chill of approaching catastrophe. The morning of June 1st dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect English summer day that seemed to mock the turmoil churning beneath Ravensmere's elegant surface. St. Michael's Church in the village of Brambleworth stood adorned with white roses and ivy, its ancient stones warmed by morning sunlight. Guests had travelled from across Hampshire and beyond, filling the pews with silk gowns and tailored coats, their whispered conversations creating a murmur of anticipation. Eleanor sat in the manor's dressing room, surrounded by her sisters and their attendants, wearing the white silk gown that had cost more than most families earned in a year. Her reflection in the mirror showed a pale, beautiful young woman with dark hair dressed in elaborate curls. But Eleanor barely recognized herself. Her father had been strangely absent all morning, sending only brief messages that he would meet her at the church. Beatrice Ashworth had helped her dress, her normally steady hands trembling slightly as she fastened the tiny pearl buttons running down the back of the gown. "You look like an angel, Miss Eleanor," Beatrice had whispered, but her eyes held a sadness that made Eleanor's throat tighten. The carriage ride to the church seemed both endless and far too short. Eleanor's sisters chattered nervously, discussing the wedding breakfast that would follow at Thornbury Hall, the impressive guest list, and the magnificent future Eleanor was about to enter. Through the carriage window, Eleanor watched the familiar Hampshire countryside roll past, memorizing every detail as if she might never see it again. When they arrived at St. Michael's, the church bells were ringing, their joyful peals at odds with the leaden weight in Eleanor's chest. Inside the church vestibule, Eleanor's father waited, and she immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Thomas Bennet's face was ashen, his cravat askew, and his hands shook as he took her arm. "Father, what is it?" Eleanor whispered, but he only shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. Before she could press further, the organ began playing, and the vestibule doors opened to reveal the crowded church interior. Every head turned to watch Eleanor's entrance. She moved down the aisle on her father's arm, her training in deportment allowing her to maintain a serene expression despite the growing sense of doom. At the altar, Duke Ashford Thorne waited with his groomsmen, his tall figure imposing in formal black. The Reverend Mr. Patterson stood ready with his prayer book, his expression benevolently expectant. As Eleanor approached, she searched the Duke's face for some sign of warmth, some indication that this union might offer more than cold duty, but his expression remained impassive. The ceremony began with traditional solemnity. Reverend Patterson's voice filled the ancient church as he spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the duties of husband and wife, and the eternal bonds being forged. Eleanor made her responses mechanically, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. The Duke's hand was cold when he took hers, his grip perfunctory rather than tender. They had reached the point where vows were to be exchanged when the church doors suddenly crashed open. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, and Eleanor recognized her with a shock of disbelief. It was Louisa Hartwell, daughter of the prosperous Hartwell family, whose estate lay 10 miles north of Ravensmere. Louisa was 24, known throughout the county for her beauty and her close friendship with the Duke's late wife. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, her blonde hair disheveled, and her face flushed with emotion. "Stop!" Louisa's voice rang out, echoing off the stone walls. "This wedding cannot proceed!" Gasps rippled through the congregation. Reverend Patterson froze, his prayer book half raised. The Duke's face darkened with fury, but before he could speak, Louisa rushed down the aisle, her eyes locked on Eleanor with an expression of desperate urgency. "Miss Bennet, you must not marry this man. You do not know what he has done, what he is capable of. He has—" The Duke moved with startling speed, grasping Louisa's arm and attempting to steer her toward a side door. "Miss Hartwell is unwell," he announced coldly to the congregation. "She has been under tremendous strain since my late wife's death. Please disregard this unfortunate interruption." But Louisa wrenched free, turning to face the assembled guests. "He is not grieving. The Duke of Thornbury has been courting me for months, making promises of marriage, while simultaneously arranging this union with Miss Bennet. He has played us both for fools, and I will not stand silent while he destroys another innocent woman's life." The church erupted in shocked murmurs. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. The Duke's face had gone from red to white, his jaw clenched with rage. "Furthermore," Louisa continued, her voice rising, "I bear his child, a fact he has known for 6 weeks, since before the betrothal to Miss Bennet was finalized. He promised to marry me, to legitimize the child, and then he told me yesterday that it was impossible, that the Bennet marriage was necessary for financial reasons, and that I must disappear quietly to the continent with a pension for my silence." The congregation's murmurs became an uproar. Eleanor's sisters gasped in horror. Her father swayed, and a groomsman rushed forward to support him. Eleanor felt as if the floor had tilted beneath her feet, but some deep reserve of strength kept her upright, kept her facing forward, even as her world shattered around her. The Duke made one final attempt at control. "These are lies born of hysteria and jealousy. Miss Hartwell has been unstable since—" But Louisa pulled a packet of letters from her reticule, holding them aloft. "I have your letters, your grace. Letters promising marriage, letters speaking of love, letters written even as you negotiated the terms of Miss Bennet's dowry. Shall I read them aloud to this assembled company?" Reverend Patterson found his voice. "Your grace, these are serious allegations. If there is any truth to them, this ceremony cannot continue until matters are clarified." The Duke's mask finally cracked. He turned to Eleanor, and for the first time she saw him without pretense, a man of cold calculation and casual cruelty, whose regard for others extended only to their usefulness. "This is a minor complication," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The Hartwell girl is nothing, a momentary diversion. Our marriage remains necessary, Miss Bennet, and it will proceed. Your father's debts must still be paid, and I am still his only recourse." Eleanor looked at this man she had agreed to marry, seeing clearly for the first time the prison she had nearly entered. "No," she heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. "I will not marry you, your grace. Whatever consequences follow, I will not bind myself to a man of such dishonor." The Duke's face contorted with rage. "Then your father is ruined. By tomorrow, foreclosure proceedings will begin. Ravensmere will be sold to satisfy his debts. Debts owed primarily to me, I might add. You and your father will be left with nothing, homeless and disgraced. Is that preferable to you?" Eleanor felt her father's hand on her arm, his voice broken. "Eleanor, please. We have no choice." But she had already removed her hand from the Duke's, stepping back from the altar. "I would rather face poverty with dignity than prosperity with shame," she said clearly, addressing not just the Duke, but the entire congregation. "This wedding is ended." The church dissolved into chaos. Guests rose from their pews, voices raised in shock and speculation. The Duke stood rigid with fury, his hands clenched into fists. Louisa Hartwell was surrounded by concerned matrons, her revelation having made her an object of both scandal and sympathy. Eleanor felt her sisters rushing to her side, their voices a distant buzz, as she turned and walked back down the aisle with her head high, her white gown trailing behind her like a flag of surrender that was somehow also a declaration of war. As she emerged into the bright June sunlight, the church bells had fallen silent, and Eleanor realized with strange clarity that her old life had ended. What would follow, she could not imagine, but at least it would be hers to choose. The carriage ride back to Ravensmere was silent, except for the sound of wheels on gravel and Eleanor's father's quiet weeping. Her sisters had remained at the church, their husbands whisking them away before scandal could further contaminate the family name. Eleanor sat beside her father, her wedding gown still pristine, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the turmoil in her heart. She understood that by refusing the Duke, she had sealed not only her fate, but her father's as well. By the time they reached Ravensmere's circular drive, Thomas Bennet had composed himself enough to speak. "What have we done, Eleanor?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The Duke will show no mercy. Within a week, perhaps less, we will lose everything." Eleanor took his hand, finding it cold and trembling. "Then we face it together, father. But I could not marry him, not after learning what he is." Her father nodded slowly, understanding if not entirely forgiving her choice. They entered the manor to find Beatrice Ashworth waiting, her expression one of grim satisfaction. "I heard what happened in the village," she said. "Miss Eleanor, you did the right thing. A woman must keep her soul, even if she loses her fortune." That night, Eleanor sat in her mother's old sitting room, still wearing her wedding dress, because she lacked the energy to remove it. The weight of her decision pressed down upon her, but beneath the fear and uncertainty lay something unexpected, a small, fierce spark of freedom. She had chosen. After 19 years of being shaped by expectation, directed by duty, and constrained by propriety, she had made a choice that was entirely her own. The price would be high, perhaps unbearably so, but the choice had been hers. 3 days later, the Duke's solicitor arrived with the foreclosure notice. Thomas Bennet received it in the library, Eleanor standing beside him as Cornelius Hargreaves read the legal terms in his thin, self-satisfied voice. The notice gave them 30 days to vacate Ravensmere Manor. All furnishings, livestock and property would be sold at auction to satisfy Thomas Bennet's debts. The sum owed was staggering, made more so by the punitive interest the Duke had quietly added in the days since the wedding's collapse. "His Grace has been more than generous in his patience," Hargreaves said, his tone suggesting anything but generosity. "However, Miss Bennet's rejection has forced his hand. Business is business, after all." After the solicitor departed, Eleanor found her father sitting motionless in his chair. The foreclosure notice spread before him on the desk. "I should have been stronger," he said quietly. "I should have found another way. Instead, I tried to sacrifice my daughter to pay for my own failures." Eleanor knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. "You tried to protect our family, father. There is no shame in that. Now we must find a way forward." But neither of them could see what that way might be. With no income, no prospects, and the stain of scandal hanging over the Bennet name, their future seemed impossibly bleak. It was Beatrice Ashworth who provided the unexpected solution. 4 days after the foreclosure notice arrived, she approached Eleanor in the Manor's stillroom, where Eleanor had retreated to sort through her mother's collection of herbal remedies. "Miss Eleanor," Beatrice said, her tone businesslike, "I have a proposal that may seem unusual, but I ask you to hear me out completely before rejecting it." Eleanor set down the jar of dried lavender she had been examining. "At this point, Mrs. Ashworth, I am open to any reasonable suggestion." Beatrice settled herself on a stool, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "My sister Agnes runs a coaching inn called the White Hart in the village of Hartley Cross, about 40 miles west of here. It's a respectable establishment on the London road, frequented by travellers of quality. Agnes has been widowed these 5 years and manages the inn with only occasional help from the village. She has written to me several times, asking if I might know of a responsible young woman willing to work as an assistant, someone who can read and write, keep accounts, manage staff, and present well to guests." Eleanor felt her heart skip. "She is offering me employment?" "She is offering you refuge and honest work," Beatrice corrected gently. "It would mean leaving behind everything you've known, your position in society, your connections, your identity as Miss Bennet of Ravensmere. At the White Hart, you would be simply Eleanor, a respectable young woman working for her bread. The accommodations would be modest, the work demanding, but Agnes is kind and fair. You would be safe there and independent." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since the wedding debacle. "And my father?" "Your sisters must take responsibility for him," Beatrice said firmly. "Their husbands have means, and it is past time they shouldered their share of family duty. You have sacrificed enough, Miss Eleanor. It is time to consider your own future." The prospect terrified and exhilarated Eleanor in equal measure. To work for her living, to exist outside the narrow confines of her class and upbringing, seemed both impossible and irresistible. "When would I leave?" she asked. "As soon as you're willing," Beatrice replied. "Agnes can send a wagon for you within the week. You would take only what you can carry. Clothing suitable for work, a few personal items, nothing that would draw attention or provoke questions." Eleanor made her decision that evening. She spoke to her father, explaining Beatrice's offer and her intention to accept it. Thomas Bennet wept again, this time with a mixture of shame and relief. Shame that his daughter must work as a common servant, relief that she would at least be safe. Her sisters, summoned to Ravensmere for a final family meeting, were horrified by the plan. "You cannot mean to work in an inn," her eldest sister protested. "The disgrace would be complete." But Eleanor had already made peace with disgrace. The alternative, remaining in Hampshire, living as a dependent in her sister's households, forever known as the girl who fled her wedding, seemed far worse than honest labour in an anonymous village. 6 days after the foreclosure notice arrived, Eleanor departed Ravensmere in the early morning mist. She wore a simple travelling dress of grey wool, her few possessions packed in a modest trunk. Beatrice rode with her in Agnes's wagon, driven by a taciturn man named Tom, who asked no questions. Eleanor looked back only once, seeing the manor's limestone walls gleaming in the dawn light, and then she turned her face forward toward the unknown road ahead. The White Hart Inn sat at a crossroads in Hartley Cross, a half-timbered building with a thatched roof and a painted sign showing a proud white stag. Agnes Morrow proved to be a woman of about 50, with shrewd eyes, capable hands, and a manner both warm and pragmatic. "You're welcome here, Eleanor," she said, using the Christian name only as Beatrice had instructed. "I expect hard work, honesty, and discretion. In return, you'll have a clean room, good food, and fair wages. The past stays in the past. I ask no questions about where you come from, and I'll answer none from others. Agreed?" Eleanor agreed. Her first weeks at the White Hart were the most physically demanding of her life. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for overnight guests, cleaned rooms, served in the tavern during meal times, kept the inn's account books, and fell into bed each night exhausted. Her hands, once soft and carefully tended, became rough with work. Her back ached from carrying trays and buckets of water. Yet beneath the exhaustion, Eleanor felt something unexpected, a sense of purpose and competence. She was good at this work. Her education allowed her to manage accounts with precision. Her natural grace made her an excellent server in the tavern, and her ability to converse on various topics made her popular with the better class of travellers. The tavern itself was a revelation. Eleanor had never before interacted with such a diverse array of humanity. Merchants discussing trade routes, military officers recounting campaigns, ladies travelling with their maids, solicitors arguing points of law, artists sketching in the corner, and local farmers stopping for ale after market day. She learned to read people quickly, to anticipate their needs, to deflect unwanted attention, and to cultivate the art of friendly but impersonal service. The other staff, a cook named Mrs. Fenwick, a stable boy named Jamie, and an older serving man named Robert, accepted her without question, and she found their straightforward camaraderie surprisingly comfortable. One evening in late July, about 6 weeks after her arrival, a gentleman arrived at the White Hart driving a well-appointed curricle. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair touched with grey at the temples and intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore the clothes of a gentleman but without ostentation, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. Agnes greeted him warmly. "Dr. Thornfield, we haven't seen you in a month. Your usual room?" The gentleman, Dr. Thornfield, smiled. "If it's available, Agnes. I'm travelling to London tomorrow, but decided to stop here for the night. The White Hart's hospitality is far superior to the posting houses closer to town." Eleanor served Dr. Thornfield his dinner in the private dining room, bringing roasted chicken, fresh bread, and a glass of excellent claret. He thanked her courteously, then asked, "Are you new here? I don't recall seeing you on my previous visits." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. This was the question she had dreaded, the possibility of recognition. But Dr. Thornfield's manner was merely friendly, without impertinence. "I've been here about 6 weeks, sir," she replied carefully. "I hope the meal is to your satisfaction." He assured her it was excellent, and to Eleanor's relief, asked nothing further about her background. Yet, as the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself drawn back to the private dining room on various pretexts, refilling his wine, bringing fresh candles, clearing plates. Dr. Thornfield proved to be a fascinating conversationalist, discussing his work as a physician in Bristol, his interest in new medical techniques being developed on the continent, and his concern for the health conditions of factory workers in England's growing industrial cities. He spoke to Eleanor not as a servant but as a fellow human being, asking her opinions and listening to her responses with genuine attention. It was the first real conversation Eleanor had experienced in weeks, and she found herself lingering longer than propriety suggested, drawn by the warmth of intellectual engagement she had thought lost forever. August arrived with unusual heat, and the White Hart bustled with increased traffic as families travelled to the coast and merchants hurried their goods to market before autumn. Eleanor had settled into the rhythms of inn-life, her former existence at Ravensmere feeling increasingly distant, like something that had happened to a different person. She received occasional letters from her father, now living with her eldest sister's family, his messages brief and melancholy. Eleanor wrote back with careful cheerfulness, describing the inn's daily life in terms that emphasized its respectable qualities while omitting the harder truths of her labor. Dr. Thornfield became a regular presence at the White Hart. His medical practice in Bristol was thriving, but he made frequent trips to London to present papers at the Royal College of Physicians and to study at various hospitals. He always stopped at the White Hart, staying 1 or 2 nights, and Eleanor found herself anticipating his arrivals with an emotion she hesitated to name. Their conversations continued and deepened, discussions of literature, politics, philosophy and science. Dr. Thornfield lent her books from his travelling library, and they would discuss them during his next visit. He never asked about her past, seeming to accept her presence at the inn without curiosity, and Eleanor was profoundly grateful for his discretion. One evening in mid-August, as Eleanor served dinner in the tavern's public room, a group of well-dressed travellers arrived in an expensive private coach. Among them was a face Eleanor recognized with a jolt of alarm. Charlotte Webb, a young woman from a family neighbouring Ravensmere, who had been a guest at Eleanor's ill-fated wedding. Charlotte was 22, known for her beauty, her wealth, and her talent for gossip. She swept into the White Hart accompanied by her mother and brother, immediately commanding the best table and demanding Agnes's personal attention. Eleanor retreated to the kitchen, her heart racing. Agnes found her there moments later, her expression concerned. "That's the Webb family from Hampshire," Agnes said quietly. "Miss Webb is asking why a coaching inn would employ a lady's maid who dresses above her station. I told her you're my niece, helping with the business, but she seemed suspicious. Can she cause you trouble, Eleanor?" Eleanor explained briefly her connection to the Webbs and the circumstances that had brought her to Hartley Cross. Agnes listened without judgment, then patted her shoulder. "Stay in the kitchen tonight. I'll have Robert serve their table. If they ask questions, I'll deflect them." But Charlotte Webb was not so easily managed. After dinner, she wandered into the kitchen on the pretext of complimenting the cook, her sharp eyes immediately finding Eleanor. "Why, Eleanor Bennet, I thought I recognized you. What on earth are you doing working in a coaching inn? Has your family truly fallen so far?" Eleanor forced herself to meet Charlotte's gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed. "I am earning an honest living, Miss Webb. There is no shame in that." Charlotte's laugh was brittle and delighted. "No shame? My dear girl, you were to be a duchess, and now you're serving ale to travellers. It's the most delicious scandal. Wait until I write to everyone in Hampshire. They'll be absolutely riveted." Eleanor felt the walls closing in, the anonymity she had carefully built about to crumble. But before she could respond, Dr. Thornfield appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been dining in the private room and must have heard the raised voices. "Miss Webb," he said, his tone pleasant but commanding attention, "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I believe you're acquainted with Miss Bennet." Charlotte turned, her expression shifting to coy interest at the sight of an attractive, well-dressed gentleman. "Dr. Thornfield, isn't it?" "Yes, Miss Bennet and I are old acquaintances from Hampshire, though I confess I'm shocked to find her in such reduced circumstances." Dr. Thornfield moved to stand beside Eleanor, a gesture of solidarity that made her heart contract with gratitude. "Then perhaps you haven't heard the full story. Miss Bennet's courage in refusing to marry a man of dishonour, despite the personal cost, has become quite admired in certain circles. There are those of us who believe that integrity is worth more than a title, and that honest work is vastly preferable to a corrupt alliance. I count myself fortunate to number Miss Bennet among my acquaintances." His words, delivered with quiet authority, seemed to rob Charlotte of her momentum. Charlotte's mother appeared then, summoning her daughter back to their rooms, and the moment passed. But the encounter had shaken Eleanor badly. After the Webbs retired and the tavern closed for the night, she sat in the kitchen with Agnes, explaining the full story of her broken engagement and the Duke's perfidy. Agnes listened, then said, "Dr. Thornfield spoke well of you. He's a good man, Eleanor, respected throughout this region. If Charlotte Webb tries to spread gossip, his word will carry weight against hers." Eleanor nodded, but she felt the fragility of her new life, how easily it could shatter with the wrong word in the wrong ear. The next morning, the Webbs departed early, Charlotte casting one last appraising look at Eleanor as their coach pulled away. Dr. Thornfield, who had also planned to depart that morning, delayed his journey to speak with Eleanor privately in the inn's small garden. "Miss Bennet," he began, then smiled. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind my intervention last night. Miss Webb's cruelty seemed to demand a response." Eleanor felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks. "You defended me, sir, when you had no obligation to do so. I am deeply grateful." Dr. Thornfield studied her face, his hazel eyes thoughtful. "May I be frank?" At her nod, he continued, "I have suspected for some time that you were not born to service, though you perform it admirably. Your education, your manner of speaking, even the way you hold yourself, these things suggest a different background. But I have also observed your courage, your intelligence, and your refusal to indulge in self-pity despite obvious hardship. These qualities matter far more to me than birth or fortune." Eleanor's breath caught. "Why are you telling me this?" Dr. Thornfield hesitated, then took her hand gently. "Because I want you to know that I see you, Eleanor Bennet, not as a duke's rejected bride, not as a serving girl in an inn, but as a remarkable woman who deserves far better than circumstances have granted her. And because I hope, when you're ready, you might consider allowing me to know you better, to court you properly with the respect and care you should have always received." Eleanor stood speechless, her hand warm in his. The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had believed possible about her future, that she struggled to find words. "Dr. Thornfield, I am a woman without fortune, without prospects, whose name carries scandal. How could you? Why would you?" He squeezed her hand gently. "Because I am a man who values character over consequence and truth over reputation. I have my own income from my practice, my own standing earned through work rather than inherited. I need no wife to bring me wealth or connections. I need only a partner who can meet me as an equal in mind and spirit. From our conversations these past months, I believe you might be such a person. But I ask nothing of you now, except that you consider the possibility. I will return in 2 weeks. If you're willing, we might speak more then." He departed before Eleanor could fully process what had happened. She stood in the garden long after his curricle disappeared down the road, her mind whirling with impossible possibilities. Agnes found her there an hour later, and with her characteristic directness, demanded to know what Dr. Thornfield had said. When Eleanor explained, Agnes smiled broadly. "That man has been half in love with you since his second visit. I wondered when he'd find the courage to speak. Well, Eleanor, what will you tell him when he returns?" Eleanor shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. How can I? He barely knows me, and You're falling in love with him," Agnes said simply. "I've seen it growing. The question is whether you'll allow yourself to accept happiness when it's offered, or whether you'll punish yourself forever for a past that wasn't your fault." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension of time. Eleanor worked mechanically, her thoughts constantly returning to Dr. Thornfield's words. She examined her feelings with the same care she once applied to needlework, trying to separate gratitude from affection, hope from desperation. Dr. Thornfield represented everything she had thought lost: intellectual companionship, respect, the possibility of a future beyond mere survival. But he also represented risk. To accept his courtship would be to make herself vulnerable again, to dare to hope after she had learned the cost of hope, deferred and denied. During this period, a letter arrived from her father with unexpected news. The Duke of Thornbury had married Louisa Hartwell in a quiet ceremony, pressured into it by Louisa's father and the threat of a scandal that would damage even a duke's standing. The marriage was reportedly tense, with Louisa's father having extracted significant financial concessions. More significantly, the Duke had sold Ravensmere Manor not at auction, but to a private buyer, a physician from Bristol named Dr. Isaac Thornfield, who planned to convert it into a convalescent hospital for those recovering from serious illnesses. Eleanor read this letter 3 times, her hands trembling. Dr. Thornfield had bought Ravensmere. He had saved it from being torn apart and scattered, preserved its dignity even as its purpose changed. And he had never mentioned it, never used this grand gesture to obligate her or win her favor. When he arrived at the White Hart 2 weeks after their conversation, Eleanor met him in the garden before he could even dismount from his curricle. "You bought Ravensmere," she said without preamble. He nodded, his expression cautious. "I did. I hope you're not offended. It was a sound investment. The property is ideal for a hospital, and I've wanted to establish such a facility for some time. But I confess your connection to the estate made it more appealing. I thought you might like knowing it would be used for healing rather than sold for profit." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, a dam she hadn't known she was holding finally giving way. "Dr. Thornfield, Isaac, I don't know how to thank you." He took her hands, his grip warm and sure. "Then don't thank me. Instead, tell me what you've been thinking these past 2 weeks. Tell me if there's any possibility you might allow me to court you properly, to offer you not rescue, but partnership." Eleanor looked up at this good, brilliant, honorable man who had seen her at her lowest and somehow found her worthy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will, gladly." The autumn of 1815 brought changes that transformed Eleanor's life in ways she could never have anticipated. Dr. Thornfield's courtship was nothing like the cold formality she had experienced with the Duke. Isaac, as Eleanor now thought of him, visited the White Hart every week, timing his trips between Bristol and London to allow for extended stays. They walked together in Hartley Cross's surrounding countryside, discussing everything from medical ethics to poetry, from political reform to agricultural innovation. Isaac treated Eleanor as an intellectual equal, valuing her opinions and challenging her ideas with respectful debate. News of their courtship spread through Hartley Cross with the speed of all village gossip, but the response was largely positive. Dr. Thornfield was respected, and Eleanor had earned affection through her hard work at the White Hart. Agnes acted as informal chaperone, ensuring propriety while allowing the couple sufficient privacy for genuine conversation. Eleanor found herself laughing again, engaging with ideas rather than merely surviving each day. Isaac introduced her to his circle in Bristol: progressive physicians, reform-minded lawyers, artists, and intellectuals who valued merit over birth. For the first time, Eleanor experienced a world where her intelligence was an asset, rather than something to be carefully concealed beneath appropriate feminine accomplishments. In mid-October, Isaac formally requested Eleanor's hand in marriage. They sat in the White Hart's small garden, autumn leaves falling around them like golden rain, and he laid out his proposal with the same careful precision he applied to medical diagnosis. "I love you, Eleanor Bennet," he said simply. "I love your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to accept injustice without protest. I love the way your mind works, the compassion you show to everyone who crosses your path, and the strength you've demonstrated in rebuilding your life from ruins. I want to spend my days working beside you, creating something meaningful together. I have purchased Ravensmere with the intention of establishing a hospital there, but I need a partner to help realize this vision, someone who understands both management and human nature. Will you marry me not as a matter of financial necessity or social obligation, but as a choice of the heart?" Eleanor said yes without hesitation. The engagement was announced in the Bristol newspapers, and within a week, Eleanor received a flurry of letters. Her sisters wrote with shocked congratulations, clearly relieved that she had somehow salvaged respectability from scandal. Her father wrote with what Eleanor recognized as genuine happiness, expressing his admiration for Dr. Thornfield and his gratitude that Eleanor had found an honorable man. Most surprisingly, Louisa Hartwell wrote a brief note congratulating Eleanor and expressing hope that they might become friends. "We are both survivors of the Duke's machinations," Louisa wrote. "Perhaps that gives us common ground." The most satisfying correspondence, however, came indirectly through Agnes. Charlotte Webb's mother wrote to her brother in Hartley Cross, and word filtered back that the Duke of Thornbury was displeased by Eleanor's engagement to some provincial physician. He had apparently made inquiries about Dr. Thornfield, discovering that Isaac was not only respected in his profession, but also financially independent and well-connected in reformist circles. The Duke had attempted to spread rumors about Eleanor's character, but his own recent scandal with Louisa had damaged his credibility. Charlotte Webb's attempts to gossip about Eleanor's fall from grace had backfired when Bristol society embraced Eleanor as Dr. Thornfield's fascinating fiancée. Her refusal to marry the Duke reframed as principled courage rather than scandal. Eleanor confronted this news with mixed emotions. She felt a guilty satisfaction in knowing that the Duke had failed to destroy her, but also a growing indifference to his opinion. What had once seemed like the end of the world, his rejection, the loss of social standing, now felt like liberation. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, found work she took pride in, and met a man who valued her for herself. The Duke's approval or disapproval seemed increasingly irrelevant to her actual life. In early November, Eleanor and Isaac travelled together to Ravensmere to inspect the hospital renovations. Eleanor had not seen her childhood home in 5 months, and her first sight of it as they crested the hill filled her with complex emotions. The manor still stood proud against the Hampshire sky, but scaffolding surrounded one wing, and workers moved purposefully across the grounds. Isaac had hired an architect to redesign the interior, bedrooms converted to patient wards, the ballroom transformed into a surgical theatre. The old conservatory becoming a recovery space where patients could benefit from sunlight and fresh air. They walked through the rooms, Isaac explaining his vision while Eleanor absorbed the strange mixture of familiarity and transformation. Her mother's sitting room would become administrative offices. The library where she had spent so many hours would remain largely intact, serving as a medical library and study. The gardens were being expanded to provide space for patients to walk during recovery. "I want this to be a place of healing," Isaac explained. "Not just for wealthy patients who can afford private care, but for anyone suffering from serious illness. We'll take paying patients to fund the hospital, but we'll also reserve beds for those who cannot pay. Medicine should not be reserved only for those with fortune." Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes as she watched her childhood home being transformed into something noble and useful. "You've given it new purpose," she said quietly. "Ravensmere could have been carved up and sold, its history erased. Instead, it will save lives. My mother would have loved this." Isaac took her hand. "Will you help me manage it? I need someone who understands both administration and human nature, someone who can oversee staff, manage accounts, and ensure patients receive compassionate care. You did all this at the White Hart. Will you do it here, as my partner in this work?" Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that Isaac was offering her not just marriage, but meaningful occupation. She would not be a decorative wife managing a household's social calendar, but an active partner in work that mattered. "Yes," she said, "yes, I will." They stood together in the library, autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows, and Eleanor felt the pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a pattern she could never have imagined 6 months earlier. The path from privileged daughter to tavern maid to hospital administrator was not one. Any young lady was supposed to walk, but it was hers, chosen rather than inherited. The wedding was planned for December, a small ceremony in Hartley Cross, with only close friends and family attending. Eleanor's father would give her away, her sisters would attend, and Agnes would stand as matron of honour. Isaac's colleagues from Bristol would serve as witnesses, and the reception would be held at the White Hart, a choice that amused Eleanor's sisters but felt entirely appropriate to Eleanor. She was marrying from the place where she had rebuilt her life, not from Ravensmere's empty halls. 1 week before the wedding, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor at the White Hart. The Duke of Thornbury arrived in his impressive coach, requesting a private interview. Agnes wanted to refuse him, but Eleanor, curious about what he could possibly want, agreed to meet him in the inn's small parlour with Agnes present as chaperone. The Duke looked older than Eleanor remembered, his face drawn and his manner less imperious. "Miss Bennet," he began, then corrected himself. "Eleanor, I have come to offer an apology, inadequate though it must be." Eleanor remained silent, waiting. The Duke continued, his words seeming to cost him effort. "I treated you abominably. I viewed our marriage as a business transaction, with no regard for you as a person. My behaviour toward Miss Hartwell was equally reprehensible. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the full extent of my failures. You were right to refuse me. Any woman with sense and courage would have done the same." Eleanor studied the man who had nearly destroyed her life, seeing not a villain, but merely a flawed human being. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I appreciate the apology. I hope you will treat Miss Hartwell with the respect and care she deserves. As for me, I hold no animosity. What happened led me to a better life than any I might have lived as your Duchess. I am grateful for how things unfolded." The Duke departed shortly after, and Eleanor realized she meant what she had said. She bore him no ill will, only a distant pity for a man who had mistaken power for happiness and possessions for fulfillment. That evening, as she helped Agnes close the tavern, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey she had travelled. From golden cage to public humiliation, to honest work, to genuine love. Each step had been necessary, each hardship had taught her something essential. She had learned her own strength, discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, and found a partner who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. On the eve of her wedding, Eleanor stood in the room above the White Hart where she had slept for 6 months. She packed her few belongings, preparing to leave this refuge for the adventure of marriage and partnership with Isaac. Tomorrow, she would become Eleanor Thornfield, a physician's wife and hospital administrator, a woman who had chosen her own path despite every obstacle. As she extinguished her candle and settled into bed, Eleanor felt not anxiety, but anticipation. The life ahead would be demanding and unconventional, but it would be meaningful, and it would be hers. Spring arrived in Hampshire with particular splendour in the year 1816, as if nature itself celebrated new beginnings. Eleanor Thornfield stood in the administrative office of Ravensmere Hospital, reviewing patient records with the careful attention to detail that had become her hallmark. The hospital had been open for 3 months, and already its reputation was spreading throughout the region. 15 beds occupied the former bedrooms. A surgical theatre allowed Isaac and visiting physicians to perform complex procedures, and the recovery gardens provided patients with restorative fresh air and sunlight. Eleanor's role had evolved into something remarkably comprehensive. She managed the hospital's accounts, ensuring that income from paying patients allowed them to maintain beds for the indigent. She supervised a small staff, nurses, orderlies, a cook and cleaners, with the organizational skills she had first learned managing Ravensmere's household and later refined at the White Hart. Most importantly, she spent time with patients, understanding their needs beyond mere medical care. She read to those recovering from surgery, wrote letters for those too weak to hold a pen, and advocated for better pain management when she felt Isaac or other physicians were too focused on treatment and not enough on comfort. Her marriage to Isaac had exceeded even her hopeful expectations. They were partners in the truest sense, discussing hospital decisions together each evening over dinner, debating medical ethics and administrative challenges with mutual respect. Isaac valued her insights, often incorporating her suggestions into treatment plans or operational procedures. Their personal life was equally rewarding. Conversations that ranged across every topic imaginable, shared laughter, quiet companionship, and a physical intimacy that Eleanor had never expected to be so tender and joyful. On this particular April morning, Eleanor was expecting a special visitor. Her father had travelled from her sister's home to spend a week at Ravensmere, seeing what his former estate had become. When Thomas Bennet arrived, Eleanor met him at the entrance, watching his face as he took in the transformation. "My dear Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it's magnificent. Your mother would be so proud, not just of what the building has become, but of what you have become." They walked through the hospital together, Eleanor explaining operations while her father marvelled at the change. That afternoon, as they sat in the recovery garden, Thomas Bennet spoke of his own journey since Ravensmere's sale. "I was so ashamed when you left for the White Hart," he confessed. "I felt I had failed you completely as a father. But watching you now, seeing how you've turned catastrophe into triumph, I realize that perhaps the greatest gift I gave you was the freedom to become yourself. You would never have discovered your strength if circumstances hadn't demanded it." Eleanor took his hand. "You gave me much more than that, Father. You gave me an education, taught me to think, and showed me through your own mistakes the importance of integrity. I needed all of those lessons to reach this point." Eleanor's transformation had not gone unnoticed in Hampshire society. Families who had once pitied or scorned her now sought her advice on establishing charitable institutions. Young women facing arranged marriages they dreaded wrote to her asking for counsel. Most gratifyingly, several women from difficult circumstances had arrived at Ravensmere seeking employment, having heard that Mrs. Thornfield hired based on capability rather than background. Eleanor had taken on 2 such women, one escaping an abusive household, another who had been dismissed from a previous position after refusing her employer's advances. Both proved capable and dedicated, and Eleanor took quiet satisfaction in offering others the second chance she had received. In May, Louisa Hartwell visited Ravensmere Hospital, now visibly pregnant and accompanied by a nurse rather than her husband. She and Eleanor walked through the gardens while Louisa explained her situation with surprising candor. "The Duke is not cruel precisely, but nor is he kind. We live as strangers sharing a household. He provides everything materially, but nothing emotionally. I am counting the days until this child is born, after which I intend to establish my own residence on the Thornbury estate and live as independently as a married woman may." She looked at Eleanor with something approaching envy. "You were braver than I. You refused him when it cost you everything. I accepted him even knowing his character, and now I'm trapped in exactly the prison you escaped." Eleanor felt profound sympathy for Louisa despite their different paths. "You did what you felt necessary to protect your child and your reputation," Eleanor said gently. "That required its own form of courage. But Louisa, you need not be trapped forever. Once the child is born and you're established in your own residence, you can still create a meaningful life. Charitable work, intellectual pursuits, friendships with people of substance, these are available to you regardless of your marital situation." They spoke for another hour, and when Louisa departed, she seemed lighter, as if Eleanor's words had opened a door she hadn't known existed. In June, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had fled her wedding at St. Michael's Church, she and Isaac hosted a celebration at Ravensmere Hospital. They invited patients, staff, donors and friends to mark both the hospital's official opening and their own anniversary. The recovery gardens were decorated with lanterns and flowers. tables laden with food prepared by their excellent cook, and musicians played in the conservatory. Eleanor wore a dress of soft blue silk, simple but elegant, and moved through the celebration with confidence that had nothing to do with birth or fortune, and everything to do with earned competence and genuine relationships. At one point during the evening, Agnes Morrow found Eleanor and pulled her aside. "A year ago you arrived at the White Hart looking like a lost soul," Agnes said. "Now look at you, established, respected, doing work that matters. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. Proud to have played a small part in your journey." Eleanor embraced her. "You saved me, Agnes. You and Beatrice both. You offered refuge when I had nowhere to go and taught me that dignity comes from work and integrity, not from titles or wealth. I will never forget that." As evening deepened into night and stars appeared above Ravensmere's gardens, Isaac found Eleanor standing near the fountain her mother had loved. He slipped his arm around her waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their guests mingle and laugh. "Are you happy?" Isaac asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she considered all important matters. A year ago, she had stood in this garden, wearing a wedding dress meant for another man, her life in ruins, and her future impossible to imagine. Now she stood here as herself, Eleanor Thornfield, hospital administrator, physician's wife, woman of purpose and independence. "I am profoundly happy," she answered honestly. "Not because everything is perfect, but because I chose this life. Every difficulty, every challenge, I face it knowing that I decided my own path. That freedom, Isaac, is worth more than any privilege I was born to or any title I might have married into. I am exactly where I'm meant to be." Isaac kissed her temple. "Then I am profoundly happy as well, because where you're meant to be is beside me." The celebration continued late into the night, and when the last guests finally departed, Eleanor and Isaac walked through the quiet hospital, checking on patients and ensuring all was well. In what had once been her father's library, now the medical library, Eleanor paused to look at the shelves lined with books on anatomy, surgery, pharmacology, and the emerging science of disease prevention. She had added her own books as well, volumes on hospital administration, nursing care, and the psychological aspects of healing. This library represented not just the accumulation of medical knowledge, but the marriage of science and compassion, skill and care, that defined everything she and Isaac were trying to build. As they climbed the stairs to their private quarters in what had once been the family wing, Eleanor reflected on the strange alchemy of circumstance and choice that had brought her to this point. The Duke's betrayal, which had seemed like complete catastrophe, had freed her from a life of privileged misery. Her time at the White Hart, which might have broken her spirit, had instead revealed her strength. Every hardship had carried within it the seed of transformation. Every closed door had led to an opening she never would have sought if the familiar path remained available. In bed that night, with Isaac sleeping peacefully beside her and the sounds of a functioning hospital carrying faintly from below, Eleanor realized something profound. She was no longer the girl who had walked down St. Michael's aisle in a silk wedding dress, hoping marriage to a duke would fulfill societal expectations. She was not even the young woman who had scrubbed floors at the White Hart, learning to survive through honest labor. She was someone entirely new, a woman who had discovered her own capabilities through adversity, found love through authenticity, and created purpose through service to others. As sleep claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was one of profound gratitude, not for the ease of privilege or the security of status, but for the harder gifts of challenge and choice, struggle and growth, failure and reinvention. She had bloomed, not in the carefully tended garden of her birth, but in the harder soil of consequences and independence. And the flowers that grew there, though harder won, were infinitely more beautiful for having been chosen rather than inherited. The story of Eleanor Bennet, who had refused a duke and found herself, would be told in Hampshire for generations to come. But Eleanor herself would be too busy living meaningfully to worry about what stories were told. She had work to do, a partner to love, and a life to build on her own terms. That was enough. That was everything. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled.